Just gone a couple of minutes past 7:30 New South Wales time here in Australia. So I'm going to get started and I will welcome others that join us along the way, and a big welcome to those that weren't able to come to the webinar this evening but are going to watch the recording. I know I've had a couple of apologies, so I hope that the recording will give you the value as well. So, okay, let me get started and I will bring up my presentation to go through this evening. Okay, so again, let me just add my welcome. This is about mandated climate reporting, and we call this here at Future Value authentic sustainability. How do we get to be authentic in not just compliance, but moving beyond compliance to actually think about what are the next layers after simply compliance? How do we think about optimizations and efficiencies? How do we then think about strategic advantage? And then how do we think about regenerating? So regenerating means leaving things better than we found them. And I think that's really an aspiration as to where we want business to be. And Future Value is all about regenerative development. So I'm the CFO and Director of Beyond Sustainability, and it's my passion as a CFO to think about the impact that we have in business and what that might mean for our planet, not just for us and for tomorrow, but for the generations coming after us. So that's a quick who we are, and I just want to acknowledge the lands that I'm coming from and that your lands that you're coming from and watching this. I am in Awabakal country in Lake Macquarie, New South Wales, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And with that, I'll just set the scene as to where we're going this evening on the webinar. So we've got 45 minutes. I'd like to be engaging and interactive. If you've got questions along the way, please reach out and ask, and let's have a conversation as we go. So welcome, introductions. First of all, we're going to talk about why act now. And as finance leaders, I'm sure it comes as no surprise about why we have to act now. But unfortunately, I think that there's a large population of finance leaders globally that haven't realised what's coming and what's needed. And it's only now that it's mandated for all businesses, no matter the size and complexity, it's now landing firmly on the CFO's plate as to why we should act now. It's now legislation. I want to take you through what I call the ESG adoption curve and thinking about maturity and why do this and why go beyond compliance, simple compliance. We're going to touch on what are the foundations of the new regulation, what is required, what does it mean, what do I have to do. We'll then talk about some challenges, and on the flip side of challenges is always opportunity. So we'll talk about those. I'll talk about moving from paralyzed to actually having an action plan. And I'll talk about some of the surveys that we did in PNG and how we got to that paralyzed kind of state of being. Also, I want to share with you some tools and templates. I promised that you would leave here with some ideas on how to build these tools. I'm also going to talk a little bit more about the training program that I'm launching in November, where you will get the tools and templates and heaps more as well. And then we'll close. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Paula Kensington, and I've been a CFO for the past 20 years here in Australia. And I've been working in commercial finance roles for over 35 years. I've worked in big business, ASX listed businesses, FTSE 100, and now I'm working with a smaller company, Future Value, but I've also spent 5 years in my own business. But something that's really come up for me in that last 5 years is how to think about future proofing and how do I think about sustainability, and that starts with climate reporting. I've also represented ACCA for 10 years on local panel governance, and also then 6 years on the Global Council, where I was also on the Audit and Risk Committee, and certainly was making sure that our member body was being held accountable to the members. So that's a role that I've also played. So I think this is the biggest shift that we're going to see in financial accounting and reporting since 2000. Since IFRS came in, this is going to be the next biggest thing that impacts the whole world, no matter to what degree. Everyone is going to feel the impact in some way, shape or another. And for those of you who know Lee White, he's now the IFAC CEO, was CAA and Z CEO. He says that professional accountants play a pivotal role in enhancing the quality of sustainability information. So don't just take my word for it. The accounting profession supports that sentiment as well. So again, why act now? This is a report taken from Deloitte's sustainability report in 2024. Climate change is a top 3 priority for CEOs. We know that 70% of C-suite leaders expect climate impacts to have a high or very high impact on their strategy and operations in the next 3 years. Again, comes as no surprise. We've got a 3-year roll-in period here in Australia, and I know that's going to impact not just those companies that have to, but all the other non-reporting entities that are going to get caught up in other people's supply chains. So this really does impact everybody. And 45% of those CEOs are saying that they're overhauling the core business model for climate transition. And that has to be driven and owned by the CFO as well. I've often said if our spreadsheets don't change, nothing changes. So we've got to think about how our spreadsheets change. What does that mean for the business model? So this is super important. So why are we not doing it? Why are we kind of slow to uptake here? And, you know, the conversations that I've been having over the last 12 months, a lot of CFOs still haven't recognised what's needed. And why is that? I think it's because we're just so busy in the operations and we've got a day job of everything else that we're doing that it's just one more thing to put on the to-do list. But there's also other reasons why we might consider there to be blockers. And I've got 4 in front of you here. So potentially governance might be vague around this. There could be the materiality and the boundaries that are impacting us. We're not sure how to make a start there. We might have system debt, or we might have scattered data. And I've talked about that in a recent blog that I think over the last 10 years, the finance team has been underinvested in the support functions and the support systems. We've always been directing finance and capital to the front end, to the revenue generation part of the business. And now we find we've got a systems debt at the back end of the business. And so that's causing us issues when we want to try and not just capture financial information and consolidate, but capturing non-financial information, which is obviously a lot of what this emissions data is about. And then there's a regulation complexity. We know that this is huge, and a lot of it has been sort of a framework, and it's still left to the company, to the organization, to the board to decide how they're going to actually report on these key fundamental pillars. So we're waiting, some companies are waiting to see what Group 1 entities are going to come out with in August 2026 around, well, how do we think about this in our financial accounts, in our glossy annual reports? How do we actually present this? So what do we mean by governance is vague, and how do we unlock that blocker? Well, I'm going to talk today about a accountability map, a roadmap that talks to those 4 pillars that the AASB is asking us to now report against. So we'll look at those. We need to think about financial metrics. What must they look like? They're new ones for us. We need to think about how this is going to impact our business models. And we need to think about how we're going to navigate and communicate with our stakeholders. How do we bring the operationalization of the regulation to the business? And that really is around, how do I understand my stakeholders? How do I engage with my stakeholders? How do I influence those in a way that's going to drive change in their behavior? Now, the materiality and the boundaries, this is, around what is material for us in our business in emissions perspective, risks and opportunities. What are the material risks and opportunities that we do want to focus on? And then how do we think about climate resilience? And how do we think about that in a way that's actually going to be building relevance for us over the next 3 to 5 years? I've talked about system debts. We've got to start collecting non-financial information. How do we do that? A lot of us have the information, but we don't know how to collect it or how to name it, how to sort of store it. So there's a lot of issues around not just the data, but the controls, and how do we think about assurance? How are we going to get ready for assurance on this? And then what are the metrics? What are the measures? What are the protocols around this? And then finally, the regulation complexity. I'm going to share with you today what a minimum value proposition might look like in terms of disclosure and work that we have to do as CFOs. What's important here is how do we build the bridge between what our financial numbers and forecasts say now to what they might say in the short, medium, long term when we start overlaying the climate scenarios. How does that change our financial forecasts, and how do we reconcile that, not just for finance, not just for our external reporting, but how do we reconcile that for our internal reporting, for our heads of operations, for our boards, audit and risk committees? There's a lot here as we start to unpack. And then how do we build these new narratives if we're going to start bringing people along on the journey? What is that new narrative? What is the new language? What are the new metrics? And how do we think about shaping that up? So I think those are the 4 key blockers. I'd be keen to hear what you think, whether they resonate with you, whether there's some others that I haven't touched on that you think are important and maybe holding you back as well at the moment. So I'd love, if you're watching this later, I'd love for you to reach out and tell me, do these 4 blockers resonate with me? You can also take the Slido poll. So clicking on this QR code or the link, it will take you to those 4 questions, and you can rate which ones you think are important or relevant for you, or add your own. So please go ahead and do that. I'll be really keen to hear what you think. So this is the ESG adoption curve. And what I say here is we've obviously got this bell curve we're familiar with. And what we think is that we are slow to making a move. So we are coming into mainstream. There are plenty of laggards, I think, on the left of the median line, but we are moving into that ESG responders where we're actually being able to take advantage of the regulation. So that might sound odd, but for companies that get ahead of the curve, that are doing this regulation before they have to, are demonstrating to their audience, to their stakeholders, that this is important, and not only important, but this takes time. So there's a period of rolling in of 3 years, but I think sometimes people are waiting for the right time to land, but actually it's going to take 12 to 18 months to start building in a lot of this ability to collect the data, a lot of this governance and policies and restructuring internally on our systems. It's going to take a lot of time, and and everyone's busy, so it's not like we've got sitting around twiddling our thumbs waiting for something to do. So it's going to take time to actually find the advocates in our business and have ESG charters built, sustainability charters, into our board charters. There's a lot of work to do. So taking advantage of building that now will give that regulatory advantage. And so you become swept up in that mainstream and working alongside peers and not getting left behind. Now, there are some companies that have been doing this already, some of the larger global entities, and I think they are already in their optimization advantage, maybe even competitive advantage, where they've been working on what's the impact that the business is having, what are the emissions reporting, and starting to actually be very loud, but transparent about what are the projects that matter to those businesses. And not only does that tick, compliance, but it actually means you've got that strategic competitive advantage where people want to do business with you, that, it's about renewing contracts. If you've got large contracts with big group one entities, they're going to ask you as a supplier to their business in their supply chain, what are you doing around climate reporting, and what are you doing around your role in sustainability and impact? Because you become their problem in a way. They have to report you, and if you're a material supplier to them, they need to start reporting on you, or including you in their reports, I should say. So, this might come up for contract renewals, for example. There's clauses, there's questions being asked around, well, where's your ESG charter, and can you talk to us about what you're doing, because that will help or might hinder contract renewals. Or there might be an RFP process, and there's a large chunk about talking about your impact on climate and sustainability in that RFP process. So they become really, sort of fundamental, really, to secure revenue opportunities. So it's not even optimization, it's part of regulation. But then that optimization, it's around, how do we think about looking at our business model in a different way? How do we think about taking advantage of efficiencies? There's a lot of people that I think over the last 2 to 5 years have said that the business case isn't there for sustainability, it's just another cost to the P&L. But actual fact now, it's been proven by so many times that the actual cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of doing something. And we'll look at that when we get to climate scenarios shortly. So as I said here, we can unlock growth, we can build capability, and we can secure contracts when we're looking at taking advantage of that compliance, that regulation. And then optimization, we can turn that compliance data into profit data. We can get the data to work for us. We will understand our business and our supply chain in more detail. We can think about the customer experience. We can think more innovatively. And we can also perhaps strengthen and accelerate our abilities to make decisions throughout the whole value chain. And then finally, competitive advantage is really about understanding the supply chain resilience, building that understanding of our business models and opportunities for leveraging as well. So what is required? I talked about the four fundamentals. There's actually 5. The 4 are governance, risk management, strategy and metrics, and the 5th is these climate scenarios. And this is in the Australian accounting standards. Obviously, this has been fed down and impacted by the international sustainability standards S1 and S2. And so what does this mean for us? We'll go into the MVP in a minute, but governance is really around what is the oversight, what are management's roles in that, where are the skills and incentives and the accountabilities and the ownership. So thinking about RACI, how does that governance structure look from a climate and sustainability perspective? And then in our risk management that we're all familiar with, how do we think about bringing climate risks into that risk management process? So identifying and managing them, but also let us not forget that there's not just the risks, but there's the opportunities. So when we think about our strategies, what are the material climate-related risks and opportunities that we want to talk about? And if you look at any of the case scenarios that I'm going to share in the training program, you can look at any of the scenarios, and companies are already using this language and what the impact on strategy will be. And over time, we've not just got to talk about the qualitative impacts, we've got to talk about the quantitative. So we've got to actually, in climate scenarios, actually say, well, what's the financial impact of that on my forecast? And again, we'll have a look at that quickly together in this session. We've got to come up with metrics, we've got to come up with measures, we've got to decide what it is that we want to be held accountable for, and we've got to explain that, not just internally, but externally. And then lastly, with the climate scenarios, we need to choose 2 scenarios. So we might pick what 2 degrees warming might have an impact on my business, but we need to choose a worse one as well. So whether that's 3 degrees, 4 degrees, what impact is that going to have on my business? And now the work that you do to understand that is how you then start thinking about your transition plan and your mitigation strategies. And this is work that I was reflecting on a couple of weeks in a conversation, that this is work we kind of did 10, 15 years ago when we were thinking about renewing insurance. It was the insurer and the insurance broker that was asking us to think, what are the scenarios and what might be our mitigation strategies? So now we're sort of 15 years later coming back and going, well, actually, we need to do this for every aspect of our business. And it's not just about buying insurance, it's about continuation, resilience, sustainability of our business. This is what all stakeholders want to see, not just the insurance stakeholders. Okay. So I promised you a quick look at some tools and techniques. So here's one of them, and this is the roadmap. So at the top, we've got those 4 categories of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. So this might be the rolled up climate reporting accountability roadmap. We'll have, what are the tasks? What has to be delivered? And if we think about governance, we need a board and a program charter that's approved. We need some RACI. We need audit and risk cadence. We need to understand who's taking accountability, who's taking ownership of this. We need to understand when that's going to be done. Where's the disclosure and the policy and the controls? And how do we assess that assurance control area? So just thinking about what are the big main ticket items, and then we will have a traffic light system that says, where are we with that? And when is that going to be due? When are we going to have that delivered by? And then underneath that, you can see, well, break out that deliverable and what are the 15 or 20 activities that have to be undertaken to be able to tick off on that deliverable. So now you start to see it's unpacking all of the detail that has to happen. So this is really helpful, I think, where you can start allocating tasks and due dates and who's going to do it, so that we can then say that we've got a roadmap. And I think this would take 12 months to actually get into the nitty-gritty to be able to actually tick this off. So you can see there's a lot more that has to be done when we start to get into the detail. Okay, so moving on, just cognizant of time. So just moving on, climate scenarios. So if you're not familiar with climate scenarios, this is published structured ways to think about how might climate scenarios play out over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, and what might that have an impact on our financial and our operating models. So we might have a disorderly, disruptive, reactive pathway. We might have high transition risks and medium physical risks. We might have a regulatory transition and early action, sort of a more structured approach to global warming. So we might have a low transition risk and low physical risk. So that might be, how do we either stay at 1.5 degrees warming or keep it under 2? The disorderly and disruptive might be, how do we think about maintaining 2.5 degrees warming or 3 degrees warming? And then on the far right is this crisis-driven global system shock. This is where we're not seeing government support around the world, and we don't have strong regulation, and we're not changing our climate actions, and we're just completely boiling our planet, and we might have a 4 or 5 degree warming. And what happens then? And so you can see, just very simple from this hypothetical example, that my operating costs baseline is 23, 24, for example. What they might be at 2 degrees warming or 1.5 degrees warming, in that middle, they might increase by 9%. But you can see to the far right, if we don't have an orderly transition plan and we go into a system shock, they might increase by 19%. you can see, again, hypothetical, but we've got to calculate these for our business. So what might be our gain or loss of market share? What might be the impact on insurance? Because obviously that's going to be a massive part of our cost base if we go into that 4-degree warming where the world is going to look very different. We might not have a business model anymore that makes that makes sense. So there's a lot here that we're going to have to start to unpack in our business. What are the pricing on carbon? What are our emissions? What are our water usage? What impacts do we have, and what are we relying on that may no longer exist or be too expensive for us to use? So we've got to think about some of these impacts here. There might be some others that are more applicable for your business, but we've got to actually start doing the work. So this is just to give you a sense what this could mean. And again, and then another sense here around, well, how do we build a new business model playbook? What are the steps that we have to take in finance to be able to think about our business model differently? How do we think about the metrics in our business models, in our spreadsheets? How do we think about the models? I've just gone through that impact climate scenarios. That's the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System. They've come up with that scenarios, and they're widely used globally. And then, what is the carbon price? Am I bringing in costs into my balance sheet, into my P&L? And what might be some financial outcome? So there's just some sort of practical steps that you can start thinking about on how this is going to impact your financial measures, financial metrics, spreadsheets, and how do we think about that? And another good one down here is executive bonuses. And I was reading a report today from KMD, which is the Kathmandu Group, and Rip Curl, and they were very explicit in their sustainability report about how they tie in the short-term incentives in their executive bonus structure. So I haven't seen too many companies yet talk about the tying in of climate action to remuneration. That is one of the strongest ways to get real change in business, is to actually reward for it. And if we don't change our reward patterns, then it's unlikely that we're going to change our actions. So that's an important piece that we actually have to be transparent about. So not only embed it, so we'll need, again, you're probably starting to get a feel for how this impacts every part of our business. We have to get, remuneration policies restructured potentially, and what does that mean? Okay. And then how do we iterate? How do we think about running and updating? How do we think about that assurance and being ready for assurance and audit? And how do we start building trust in our brand? Again, going back to that competitive advantage. So again, just a bit of a thought provocation for you to start thinking about how this might play out in your organisation. I talked about minimum requirements. So this is a document that I'm happy to share with you if you just want to reach out, and I'm happy to, or you can take a screenshot here. But these are the 4 pillars in AASB S2, the governance, the strategy, the risk management, and the metrics. So what can I do to make sure that I'm compliant? And looking at this from the CFO's perspective, you could actually start looking at this from the CEO, from the CSO, from sales, marketing, data engineering. What does everyone actually have to start thinking about against these minimum requirements? So this could be quite a handy tool for you to have. And then just sort of started to think about wrapping up now. I've got this paralysis to power, and how do we think about going from unlocking value and opening up opportunities to build resilience? And we've got a huge role as CFOs, as finance leaders, to play in this, integrating our climate data with our financial statements. So not only do we have to get our CFO to sign off on that, as well as the CEO and the board, we actually have to make that happen within the sort of wheelhouse of finance. So what are the metrics that are going to drive change, and what is the messaging that's going to be able to balance assurance with action. So yes, of course, you can do this on your own. I've just spent the last 18 months understanding all of the requirements and building out a training program that's going to help CFOs to educate and empower themselves. It's not just about outsourcing and getting consultants in to do this work. It's actually, how do I embed this work myself? So I've got a 3-day program, mandated climate reporting, and this is what we go through. So how do we set the foundations? How do we understand the regulation? How do we go through that 4-pillared roadmap? How do we document a board-ready narrative with decision matrices? How do we define roles and responsibilities, and how do we think about decision rights? And then, so that's kind of day 1. And then day 2, we then start to think about how does that translate into our business? So how do we stand up the environmental ledger? How do we kick off supplier programs in AP? How do we understand the data? How do we prepare for audit and risk to be able to report and support us in the disclosures, controls, and procedures? And then finally, we build the bridge to our financials. How do we create those climate scenarios? How do we document assumption registers? How do we build that bridge from what we've got in our financial forecasts to what climate 1, 2, or 3 might look like? And then how do we align our capital allocation policies with that climate resilience? So there's a lot there, as you can see, but it's really around how do we make it engaging and interactive, and something that's very tangible and tailored for individuals. So that's my program that I'm kicking off in November. I will just click over here. You can see that here on the QR code and the website futurevalue.global/MCR. If you're interested in understanding more, which is why I think you came along to the webinar tonight. So as I said, right at the start, when I look over here on the left-hand side of our beautiful pyramid, this is the starting point. This is around compliance. This is around how do we get compliant and meet regulations. But we go beyond that. Then we start unlocking this optimization advantage. We start building efficiencies. We start lifting up around, showing with transparency that we understand the impact that we're having, and and we might not be doing all the best things now, but we've got a plan that says this is how we're going to reduce our emissions or impact, and start going up the pyramid. And then we might get to strategic advantage. How do we actually make this something that's like a competitive edge, where our peers are not doing this, but we are, for example, and taking an opportunity, taking advantage of opportunities. It's not just about risk reduction here. And then getting up into this purpose, getting up into authentic sustainability, getting into this area where we're actually doing business for the benefit of all stakeholders, not just the shareholders. So financial leadership is paramount in this. How do we be a voice to be heard in the business? We see everything in finance, so we are well placed to lead the understanding of this as well. So how do we build that long-term resilience through data and action, and how do we turn that compliance into competitive advantage? And for our stakeholders, they want to understand new metrics, new language, and new playbooks. We want to make sure we've got the right governance structures, and that we've aligned our climate compliant behaviour, and that we're ready for assurance. So this is here now, and this is going to take a lot of time to set up. So I think no matter whether you're in group 2 or 3 or a non-reporting entity, this is here right now, and we have to take action. And the sooner we do it, the more time we have to finesse and to get the data right. And it will be a roll-in period over the next 3 years. But I certainly would advise against waiting until the last possible moment, because then the journey is quite different when you're not in the driving seat and you're being driven from the back seat. So that's really what I wanted to share tonight. I hope it's been valuable for you. I would love to hear what you think and hear from you. Please watch videos. If you're interested in knowing more about the program, the training program, it's really a 3-day program, as I said. And I think, not only does it give you all the foundations and the tools and the templates and the case studies and insights from CFOs that have done this work and are sharing the challenges that they found so that they can share them with you, our peers, so that we understand and we do it together. We're not doing this on our own. I think, it can feel very isolating as a CFO. So, I think the training program brings community together, and we will have ongoing platform access and dialogue and support. So I'm going to leave things there, and I thank you for watching, and as always, here for conversations if you would like. So thank you for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.